Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Mark Kligman. I am the director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience at UCLA and the Herb Alpert School of Music, and we welcome you to this program. This is a three-part program, and now we're involved in part two, which is connected, which is going to be a wonderful conversation. The context of our work is a wonderful program we're doing at UCLA that starts this Sunday that's related to a big project looking at music and justice. And we have a concert that will be at 4 p.m. Pacific on Sunday that is viewable online. And we hope all of you can join us and watch that online. And I'll post the link to that shortly. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two guests for today. Our guests are Garrett McQueen and Michael Laster. I'll quickly introduce them and then throw the program over to them. So Garrett McQueen is a proud native of Memphis, Tennessee, and accomplished bassoonist. He has played with orchestras and ensembles throughout the U.S. and has performed with chamber ensembles and as a soloist. In 2012, McQueen's musicianship earned him the title of one of America's, quote, most interesting classical musicians, unquote, by conductor and author of the Real Toscanini Musicians Reveal, the maestro Cesar Civita. As an activist, he gives voice and space to music by Black creators and marginalized composers. In addition to remaining active in performance spaces, Garrett is the host and producer behind a number of nationally syndicated radio programs, including The Sound of 13 and The Sounds of Kwanzaa. He continues to work as a guest radio host in a number of American markets. He specializes in music and racial equality and collaborates with many music festivals and organizations. He is executive producer and co-host of Trilloquy podcast and the president of Trillworks Media. If that is not enough, he directs and serves on boards of other arts organizations and is a contributing writer for Represent Classical. Michael Laster, who we also welcome to our program, is a composer, songwriter, guitar and piano instructor living in New York City, who has written for orchestra, film, string quartet, voice, solo piano, and other chamber ensembles. He's a graduate of the City College of New York. He's a composer of traditional orchestral works and film, as well as chamber works and large-scale piano works, which he has written for Robert Frankelberry and Craig Ketter. Michael maintains a busy private teaching studio, scores films, gigs and clubs, and arranges for colleagues, including social activist Peter Joseph. He's a recipient of the Presser Scholarship of the City College of New York, and he studied with David Del Tredici, Manhattan-based composer. Guitarist Michael Laster has been a fellowship composer at the Seasons Music Festival in Washington, where he worked with Darren Hagen, Larry Allen Smith, Chris Brubeck, and the Winter Green Summer Music Festival in Virginia, where he worked with Gilda Lyons. Today is the start of a two-part conversation that they're having that is entitled To the Promised Land, Facilitating Mutual Healing Through Dialogue with Garrett McQueen and Michael Laster, and we invite them to our program, and I'll pass it over to Garrett.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those introductions, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm especially excited to engage in this dialogue today with Michael. The first thing that I will say, if there's anything that you hear or take away from this conversation, is that the power of dialogue is key. The power of dialogue must be centered as we think about ways in which various communities, various marginalized communities, can find points of unity and in an effort for us to move forward together. The way to the future is together, and dialogue is how Michael and I have facilitated that personally, and how we help to inspire each of you to facilitate that in your own lives moving forward. As Mark mentioned, this is a two-part conversation. So today, Michael and I are going to engage in dialogue at the intersections of Black and Jewish experiences broadly and as it relates to music. And in part two of the dialogue, we'll cover cover some of the things that we talked about today and make direct connections with the concert that's coming up on Sunday. And with that, Michael, I'd love to get us started by your saying just a few more words about yourself, why you're here engaged in this conversation, and what you hope that people will take away from it.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett, and thanks, Mark and UCLA for having me on. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm Michael Laster. As Mark mentioned, I'm a composer, a songwriter, a music teacher of guitar and piano, freelance, and I've scored some films in the past. And, just an all-around music lover of all styles and all genres, from, any point in history. And there's always, great quality music, regardless of where it comes from. And always something for me to learn whenever I listen. And so that's who I am. And, I'm here because basically I'm a friend of Garrett's, and Garrett invited me to be on. And, when he invited me on, I was initially like, do I, really know enough about these topics? Because I'm not a historian, I'm not any sort of authority figure, I'm not any sort of representative of any of these issues. But then I realized, well, wait a minute, like the point of this is to engage in dialogue, and you shouldn't have to be any of those things in order to, build bridges between like different communities and engage in these conversations. So what I expect to, accomplish through this isn't some sort of, great miracle work between the Black and Jewish communities where it's like, oh, we've been oppressed. We have a lot to kvetch about, and you've been oppressed. So, Garrett blows a shofar and then I start breakdancing and everything's okay in the world. No, that would just be sad for everyone. Like, we just want to like bring a realistic conversation about the obstacles and the opportunities and the potential to grow, heal, and engage in dialogue, listen to each other, and inspire other conversations just like this.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, yeah, just a little bit more about me. In addition to producing radio and podcasts and serving as a figure in arts administration with my role with the New York-based American Composers Orchestra, the umbrella that I do put my work under is activism. With that said, like Michael, I don't mean to position myself as a representative or as an authority on any of the things that we're going to talk about today. But as it was said, our goal is to make sure that we can offer as an example the power of dialogue, what we have both learned in the process of preparing this presentation, and hopefully, ultimately, giving everyone the empowerment to engage these things on your own within your communities, not only toward building unity and greater understanding between Black and Jewish communities, but various communities across our various ecosystems. So to get us started, I'll be jumping in and out of screen share today. And to get us started, I want to note the degree to which I really learned about Black and Jewish camaraderie over the ages. This is not a new conversation. This is not a new concept. It's something that has been in place for many decades now. And through more contemporary challenges, we have forgotten, but we must also remember that there is a historical precedent for the unity between those communities. I also want to note that for many people, for many individuals, this conversation is more than conceptual. It's the culmination of a lived experience. There are a number of people who exist within Black and Jewish ecosystems at the same time. People like Sammy Davis Jr., Willie the Lion Smith, Drake, Maya Rudolph, Eric Andre, Jackie Wilson, Nissim Black, and many, many other people. So as we engage this dialogue, one of the first things that Michael and I want to make clear is that there are individuals who live at these intersections. There is a precedent for these types of conversations, and that the area around it is exactly where some of those dissonances lie, but where the healing lies as well. So, Michael, I have to say, learning more about Black Jewish individuals, people who live both of those existences at the same time, really has highlighted for me the idea of being Jewish as more than a religion, but a lived experience in itself. I wonder how significant that delineation is from your experience, the religion versus the culture and the lived experience.
Yeah, the interesting thing to note about the artists you just highlighted, or performers you just highlighted, is that they're at the intersection, but some of them for different reasons. So you could be you can have like a Jewish parent and a Black parent, and you're mixed, and that's how you find yourself at the intersection. For others, you're Black, and you convert to Judaism out of choice, which is what Sammy Davis Jr. did. It's what Jackie Wilson did, and it's what the rapper Nissim Black did. And they each have their own reasons for it, but all are, equally legitimate ways to be at that intersection.
I think there are a lot of potential at those intersections of the respective communities. For me, learning about Sammy Davis Jr. converting to Judaism, for example, opened a door of curiosity. Understanding someone like Drake, as famous as he is, to live at that intersection, it really shows to me areas where there is just so much learning that can be done, and that I'm continuing to do. I wonder if you think of sort of potentials for learning or curiosity at those intersections from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it can break preconceived notions that if you're Jewish, you look a certain way, that you're a certain shade, that there's an idea that Black Jews don't really exist because they're not very visible, but they do exist. And I think Judaism to be Jewish is an interesting thing because it's both a religion and it's seen as an ethnicity. But I don't think you can boil down the essence of being Jewish to either one. I think those who converted, if regardless of what race you are, like if you're dedicated to the religion and you made that type of commitment, in some ways you're practicing Judaism, or can be considered, well, I don't want to say more of a Jew, but in a way, like I'm very secular, right? I'm Jewish and an atheist pretty much at the same time. And for me, that's not really a contradiction. I see myself as ethnically Jewish, and whatever I believe, I'm still essentially Jewish in my ethnicity. But
And
for others, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that's very interesting, because what that makes me think about is the Black experience as it has historically related to religion. So Black isn't a religion, at least not one that I've heard of so far, but there is the idea that the Black identity is automatically connected to the Black church, and those sorts of traditions. And I'm a practicing Buddhist, but I certainly do have a history in the Black church, and it impacts my view on music most certainly. When we talk about spirituals and those sorts of things, but also the power of the Black church as a historical need for organization, for protest, and all of those sorts of things. You know, for example, when we think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., at least speaking for myself, I think about how the pulpit for him was one of those major platforms that helped propel the cause. So I think in a similar way that you describe being Jewish as more than a religion, a lived experience, and one that can exist at many different intersections. I think the same applies to being Black in America, all the way to the intersection of being Black and Jewish. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
So, in celebration of that intersection as it exists musically, we're going to transition here with a short performance from Sammy Davis Jr.
Whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, whether I find a place in this world or never belong, I gotta be me, I gotta be me. What else can I be but what I am? I just want to live, not merely survive. And I won't give up the dream of life that keeps me alive. I gotta be me, I gotta be me. The dream that I see makes me what I am. That faraway prize, the world of success. It's waiting for me if I heed the call. I won't settle down or settle for less. As long as there's a chance I can have it all, I'll go it alone. If that's how it must be, I can't be right if I'm not right for me. I gotta be free, I gotta be free. Daring to try to live it or die, I gotta be me. I'll go it alone. If that's how it must be, I can't be right if I'm not right for me. I gotta be free, and I wanna be free. Daring to try to do it or die. I gotta be me.
So when I think about those lyrics, I gotta be me, Michael, what I tend to think about is how we define ourselves, how we determine who we are. And oftentimes, certainly for Black and Jewish communities respectively, that takes a look back at the past, really defining ourselves by what lies behind us. Before we get into specifics, I wonder what your thoughts are on that phenomenon, communities defining themselves on history and oftentimes on some of the more painful or dissonant history.
Yeah, so for me, like it's always a little bit of sort of problematic territory when we talk about like how communities define themselves, because like even the defining of a community like can be very multifaceted, right? Because within each community, there are different, all sorts of different sub-communities, and not just in terms of demographics and like the makeup, but in terms of the belief, or when it comes to religion, degree of religiosity. The Orthodox and Hasidic communities have very different ways of defining themselves probably than someone like me. And, you know, someone like you has a very different way of defining yourself than, you know, a lot of other Black voices out there.
Yeah,
And
and in that,
yeah,
community defining, one of, I think, the struggles, one of the dissonances that come from that is sort of the oppression Olympics, as it were, as people sort of joke around by saying, I agree with you, and want to underscore the point that you made. In that there isn't a Jewish community as much as there are Jewish communities. In the same way for Black folks, I really work hard not to use the phrase Black community because
right.
there's so much diversity within Blackness, Black communities. But even so, there are the existences of certain histories that bind us together, and ones that have to really be acknowledged as we engage in these sorts of conversations. So for me, when I think about some of these community defining aspects of Black history and the Black present, of course, we have to talk about the transatlantic slave trade for many decades. Certainly when I was a student, that's where education on Blackness began, really being defined in the context of history through slavery. Of course, in more contemporary years and more recent years, there have been studies about the existence of communities, even kingdoms on the African continent prior to the transatlantic slave trade. But for many, that is a starting point and something that we have to make sure that we actively speak to so that our communities, Black communities specifically, aren't defined by that very horrible bit of history.
Yeah,
Go
and just
ahead.
to drive the point home, like, you know, Blackness as we define it is really a white construct, because
Mm,
those slaves from Africa were, you know, they saw themselves as members of individual tribes. And,
absolutely.
you know, they had those tribal identities, you know, erased once they became slaves, and then treated as a whole entire group based on their, you know, condition of being enslaved.
That's exactly right. And the continued violence being that erasure of those independent and individual identities. I really do wish that I could know what happened in my family and my family lineage prior to about the year 1890. I'm actually a rare case. I'm very lucky that my mom is dedicated to archiving and research. So we do know the name of the enslaved woman who we can point our lineage back to, actually a woman named America.
You want
Uh,
to share your, you talking right now? Because it's on the slide.
Oh, sure, sure, absolutely. But before we do that, I'll just also mention that, of course, post slavery, we had things like Jim Crow and Black codes that
Yeah.
continue to oppress Black communities. The war on drugs as something that we now recognize as something that was violently centering Black communities, and of course, the continued conversation of police brutality and contemporary anti-Black racism as it exists. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next slide, and Michael, maybe you can speak to some of the sort of community defining histories when it comes to the Jewish narrative and Jewish communities.
Yeah, so when it comes to the Jewish narrative and Jewish history, like, it's important to note that, you know, there's a mythical aspect to the Exodus from Egypt. Like, I think it would be a mistake to like lump that in with actual known things in history. I think, you know, it's still up for debate whether or not, you know, Jews in mass were actually like enslaved in Egypt and there was an exodus. You know, Israeli archaeologists, you know, searched for, you know, evidence of a mass exodus and they didn't find anything, but I guess the jury's still out on that. But yes, it starts with the enslavement in Egypt, according to the narrative. And from that, you have all sorts of displacement of Jews from Israel all over, you know, the Middle East and Europe. And, that idea of being without a homeland is one large part of the Jewish narrative. And, in Europe and elsewhere, there's persecution, there's, enormous anti-Semitism on the part of a lot of Europeans, either, through the church or through pogroms in Russia and what's called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews lived on shtetls, small poor communities usually, and they were attacked by, sometimes military, sometimes just the local Christians of the area. And then, of course, that all culminated in the Holocaust. And that is probably, the biggest, that's definitely the biggest atrocity to the Jewish people. And but after that ended and came to definite end, there are still challenges. And we're here to talk about, some those challenges in terms of beliefs, conspiratorial beliefs about, Jewish control of finance or Jewish control of Hollywood and the entertainment industry, or, Jews trying to, work against, real white people by supporting minorities.
And we're definitely going to get into that conversation
Yeah,
of
yeah.
whiteness as it applies. But one thing that, your words reminded me of, matched with the imagery from Charlottesville back in whatever year that was. I think it was 2017, maybe. That was so clearly through what they were chanting an example of contemporary anti-Semitism, in addition to being a reverberating sort of scene of how anti-blackness has looked over the years with the torches and the night gatherings and all of those things. As horrific as it is to really say and contextualize, finding unity in a shared struggle against white supremacy would seem to be an incredible jumping off point for dialogues that can cultivate more unity between Black communities and Jewish communities. What do you think about shared struggle as a tool for unity?
Yeah, I think, trying, uh, identifying, white supremacy as, a sort of a common enemy, so to speak, of both communities. Because, white supremacists obviously don't like Black people and see Jews as going against the interests of white people through their, philanthropy to various causes, whether it's, immigration reform or whether it's civil rights or, any progressive cause. There's been a lot of philanthropy. And, white supremacists don't like that. That contributes to the idea of like the great replacement theory
Mm.
that, America should be, majority white and is best majority white, but, there were that white people are going to become a minority and that's a bad thing for the sake of America. Yeah.
One of the really challenging parts of this dialogue, one of the places where I think a lot of dissonance comes from, is the idea of continued systemic oppression versus the non-continuation of at least state-funded oppression. So when I think about the reverberations of slavery, of Jim Crow, of general anti-blackness, I think about the fact that we do have a disproportionate amount of Black people imprisoned. I think about the fact that across the United States, certainly in the state of Minnesota, where I live, there are still conversations about ratification of the Crown Act, as it's popularly known, this idea that there has to be legislation for Black people and other people of color to wear our hair the way that we choose to wear our hair in the workplace and in other facets of society. The other part of that conversation, and maybe where there is often misunderstanding, is the idea that the end of World War II ended anti-Semitism. I wonder if you can speak to continuations or reverberations of systemic anti-Semitism in a way that it's very obviously and easily identified from the Black experience.
Yeah, I'd say, even though these things can be said to be systemic, they're not equal in magnitude to the Black experience. I think that's important to emphasize, but you can, just note that when it comes to the way calendars or the week is pretty much organized, Friday is considered a weekday, and you have Saturday and Sunday off, but pretty much that comes from a Christian-centered understanding of, Sunday is the holy day, and Friday being a regular weekday. Whereas if you observe the Sabbath on Friday, that could be an issue when it comes to wanting to be able to work, but also having religious obligations. So, it might be important to make sure that employers, give accommodations to Jewish workers, or some sort of legislation is passed to allow Jewish people to, take time off for the Sabbath if they're observant. And, I imagine there might be some discrimination on the part of like Orthodox Jews who say want a job outside the Hasidic community or Orthodox community, but are discriminated against because of the way they dress. So I think those are some important, parallels.
And raising awareness around the issues that you have mentioned, I think, is also vital. So, in my work with the American Composers Orchestra, I facilitate partnerships with orchestras across the country to get composers living and breathing like yourself, Michael, readings and recordings of new works. So, in the formation of one of those collaborations that is scheduled actually for next spring, April of 2024, it was brought to my attention that the proposed dates overlapped with a Jewish holiday that would prohibit people who observe that holiday from potentially participating in the readings for the orchestras. I was not aware of this, and I actually didn't know much about the holiday that was being mentioned, but I took it upon myself to do everything that I could to be accommodating, and ultimately the resolution was a shifting of the date. There was no real difficulty. There was no bending over backwards, but it was all rooted in just that level of awareness. So in the same way that we know that stores will be closed on December 25th, I think that we need to broaden our understanding of what some of these other holidays and observances are, just to make sure that we aren't even unintentionally stepping on toes or prohibiting participation in certain things because of those holidays and observances.
Yeah, yeah. And, a lot of Jewish holidays, are already considered like national holidays. And, that's definitely a good thing. But like, if there are more, then, I think what you're doing is definitely in the right direction to make things as accommodating to as many people as possible.
Yeah, my offices and businesses were closed this past Rosh Hashanah. So I really took not only the opportunity to learn a little bit more about that holiday, I really enjoyed a midweek break, if I may
Yeah.
say.
Or
say so.
or Sha Na Na, as Dave Chappelle says.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we're going to get to our next musical transition, but just for a little context, the music that we're going to listen to comes from Pixar's The Prince of Egypt, and you already mentioned briefly, Michael, the mythology behind that story of Jews in Egypt. But as we can see demonstrated through the tradition of Negro spirituals and many other narratives, that is a shared point. That is a shared culture. Enslaved people in the United States definitely saw themselves in that story in the same way that Jewish communities see themselves in that story. So, as we talk about shared points of struggle, I think it's also important to highlight shared points of triumph. You know, the way that the story ends is, you know, Moses parting the Red Sea and the Jews escaping the clutches of the Pharaoh. So in this excerpt that we're going to hear, I actually chose a very short excerpt from the song "When You Believe," as put forward in the film, but it actually highlights a tune that I didn't know at the time this movie came out, that I can now sing every word of to the best of my ability. But the translation is "The Song at the Sea," and I wanted to highlight this just to show an example of how shared narratives, shared stories, and the ways in which Black communities and Jewish communities have seen themselves in that biblical story can result in shared learning. So here's just a bit of that to transition us.
You will when you please.
Michael, are you very familiar with that film? Was that a part of your childhood?
No, no, it actually wasn't.
Wow, wow. Yeah,
I
that was certainly a key component of my growing up. And in retrospect, you know, there was no way for me to really understand the significance of the inclusion of the Hebrew tune, the song at the sea. But as I think back on it now and even look at it now, it seems quite significant for even that bit of the culture to be infused into something that Black people broadly claim as our own.
Yeah, and this can bring us back to spirituals and the role that played, because you just think of like, go down Moses, let my people go. Like, my dad would sing that during Hanukkah, and I always thought it was a Jewish tune, but it turns out to be a spiritual.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've come to the point in our dialogue where we have to talk about one of many misunderstandings and bits of misinformation as they exist in our respective communities and across society in general, with the first of those issues being Jewish people being white, or white approximation of Jewish people. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to this from your perspective, you know, when and how this occurred and what sort of missteps exist within that specific part of the dialogue.
Yeah, so it's a question that follows a question, like, are Jews white? And then the next question, well, according to who? And the answer is, well, you know, according to different people at different times. Because like I see myself as Jewish and white at the same time, and like that's not any sort of, you know, point of cognitive dissonance for me. Though I know a lot of other Jewish people like wouldn't consider themselves like white or have that experience, you know, based on bullying or harassment by, you know, their Christian peers, and like in high school. And, you know, maybe I had like a unique experience with going to sort of a private high school for kids with like mild learning disabilities, and a lot of my classmates were Jewish. But also I just feel like in a city as, you know, diverse as New York, you know, I am still white relative to the amount of Black and Hispanic and Middle Eastern and, you know, Asian, you know, dark-skinned Asian groups I see. And yeah, for me, I feel like I'm just Jewish and white at the same time. Like when it asks on government documents or health documents, it's like, you know, are you Black? No. Am I Hispanic? No. Am I Native or Pacific Islander? No. So that just leaves, you know, white/Caucasian, and I check that box, and I'm like, oh, okay. If there was a Jewish box, I'd check that. But, you know, by process of elimination, I guess I'm white.
And, you know, in general, I think as a society, it would be best for us to move away from the requirement of checking boxes, even beyond race and identity. When we think about gender, you know, we have us begin to really engage that conversation of not forcing a binary way of identifying in that way. With that
Yeah,
being said,
unless it's
go ahead.
relevant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with that being said, you know, I've made it a personal part of my work when I have to put together surveys or eligibility requirements that do require those questions. I've made a point to include a Jewish box to check. Again, not that boxes should be required, but that being seen, you know, from my perspective, it must be very important. In addition to helping continue the conversation of separating this idea of whiteness and Jewishness as one thing that exclusively exists together in that way. There's a very famous actor turned talk show host whose name I won't say, who actually sort of stepped in it a while ago by contextualizing the Holocaust as not being race-based. Of course, from her perspective, whiteness and Jewishness was one thing, but as we're continuing to really dive into when we talk about that nuance, we have to make that delineation. I wonder if you could speak to a good starting point or maybe middle point of that conversation. How and why is that delineation important?
Yeah, and I don't think, you know, if someone makes that mistake, which is really like a historical mistake, not like not necessarily just like objectively wrong, but like based on the circumstances, you know, that it wasn't factual. But you know, I don't ascribe any like, you know, malevolent intent to her mistake or anything. It's important, I think, to let her off the hook for that. But like if we take her view all the way, then like every struggle is man against man,
Hmm.
because race as we define it is somewhat arbitrary. There are just all these genes spread out throughout the world, and we draw these arbitrary circles around different ones and say, this is this race, this is that race, this is that race. When, you know, like hundreds of years ago, like before nation states, it's just this tribe and that tribe and that tribe and that tribe.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think the other thing that has to be addressed when we talk about misinformation and the unlearning that many people, many of us have to do is this false narrative of original Jews, as has been perpetuated by certain religious groups, namely of the Black Hebrew Israelites. You know, this is something with origins in Jim Crow era America. So we're dealing with populations of people who had basically been tossed to the side. There was no systemic um, reparation or anything along those lines to support those people. So you had a group of heavily injured physically and emotionally communities of people looking for a bit of that respite, and that's where that is what was exploited in a way, if I may use that word, in the formation of this narrative. The pain of American racism was the result of a chosen people narrative in a less positive way, as we were previously talking about the way that Black people have taken on that story of the Exodus from Egypt. Not to mention empowerment and access to resources, you know, as the fuel for the continuity for those false narratives.
Yeah, which is sad because like it is like the opportunity for it to be a meeting point, as opposed to a clashing point. But unfortunately, like when you take the Old Testament and say, you know, the original Jews are, you know, Black, or, you know, Jesus is Black, like that, I think, you like in a vacuum, that's okay if like, you know, the race isn't really that important. But if you're saying, if that also comes with like the accusation that current Jews aren't real Jews, you
Right.
know, then, you know, you run into trouble, because, you know, you're trying to accuse, you know, people who identify as Jewish as like being imposters of some sort.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what doesn't help is when our leaders, when Black leaders perpetuate some of these ideas and these ideals. With that being said, there have been many individuals over the years to do their best to bridge those gaps and to humanize people so that we're thinking about the human being not squarely based on their misinformation or where they have been taught incorrectly, but how we can act as harbingers for truth and to help people understand what is actually there. And one person who has notably done that in a very incredible way is a violinist named Elaine Scoridon Foreman. We're actually going to watch a short excerpt from a documentary where she speaks about one of the musicians who she trained. And there, for a trigger warning for people, the person in question is Louis Farrakhan. So we won't be hearing from Louis Farrakhan, but we're going to be hearing from Elaine Scoridon Foreman regarding the whys behind she took on the task of helping to coach him in a performance of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. So we'll watch a little bit and hear from her now.
I went to his home when we met, and I found him to be most cordial and gracious and charming and in love with music. He explained to me how, as a youngster, he had studied the violin and really didn't have any formal training since the time he went off to college. What he had studied but never quite completed was his favorite violin concerto by Felix Mendelssohn. So he thought this would be the perfect thing to perform, but we had to do a lot of work because he only learned the first movement, and there are 3. So we got started the following week. What was so very interesting was the fact that the minister picked a concerto by a Jewish composer, and all of his most admired violin virtuoso artists were all Russian Jews. And also, so was his teacher. I think back in Boston, must have been from the name that he gave. I can't quite remember his name. And so am I. When you see someone who does something who's very talented, you can see it right away, you can hear it right away, that they have this inborn natural talent. And that was very evident in the way he played.
The minister worked hard to master difficult passages like this one.
All sorts of different combinations of use of the bowing and being all over. Did you notice it went from the lowest notes to the highest notes, and it had trills and double stops and everything combined, all in quick succession.
So the question that immediately comes up was, did Elaine know who she was dealing with? Was she familiar with the reputation and the very harmful words put forward by him? And in this news article, the quote is from her: "My husband told me, you never turn down a challenge in your life. Why would you turn down this one?" And not only do we have the example of Elaine, but there are so many other people who have bridged that gap, from Leonard Bernstein to Abel Meeropol, whose music we'll be hearing shortly. Even Louis Armstrong, who many don't know, wore a Star of David around his neck over the course of his career because of the support that he received from a Jewish family. We also see Bob Dylan there in conversation with James Baldwin. So, Michael, the first thing that I think that we have to make clear is that this is not an attempt to absolve Farrakhan or anyone of the very extremely harmful things that have been said, as much as it's an example of a bridge being gapped through Elaine's work. There was a performance by this man featuring the music of a Jewish composer with an orchestra and an audience filled with not only Black and Jewish people, but also members of the Nation of Islam. This is something that happened, you know, maybe 30 minutes in the course of contemporary history, where people sat down and were able to share something joyously. What is to be said about that when it comes to the way each of us engage narratives, and especially think about the people in our lives that challenge us the most?
Yeah, well, I couldn't have said it better myself, but I just want to really repeat and emphasize what you said, just for the sake of clarity. Like, you know, Garrett and I, you know, are not using her as an example to like let Farrakhan off the hook, so to speak. Garrett and I both agree he said things that, you know, are completely indefensible. This is really there for historical context, to show that certain, you know, things aren't as black and white as they seem, that sometimes there are bridges that are, you know, created or built in some of the most unlikely places sometimes. And I think now would be a good time for me to bring up an extreme case, or maybe not so extreme case, of Daryl Davis, who actually goes around talking to actual white supremacists. He's a Black man who is like a blues pianist. He plays amazing boogie woogie piano, and he has dialogues with, you know, the most extreme white supremacists to try to change their views by presenting himself like as a human being that they can talk to. And a lot of the time it works, and sometimes it doesn't work. And I think it's up to every individual to decide exactly, you know, what their boundary is, and like how much they're going to engage with people who are difficult, so to speak. Because, you know, some people are more willing than others to, you know, be open and listen. And, you know, my own view is if people are willing to change and hear you out, you know, you should probably engage with them. If not, don't waste your time.
I would definitely agree with that. I remember the first, and I've actually had the pleasure of being in dialogue with Daryl Davis. I remember the first time I heard his story, I said to myself, wow, I am not there. I would never sit down with a member of the Klan, just really putting my foot down. But the more that I think about the hope for a goal, we titled this presentation To the Promised Land, not a physical place, but this existence of unity and dialogue as the bridge to that. It really makes me challenge myself in really expanding my sphere of opportunity when it comes to bridging those gaps and engaging
Yeah.
those dialogues.
Yeah, so it makes you, frame it as two potential, modes of action, which, hope to achieve the same goals, which is like building allyship with those people who are sympathetic, but also trying to de-radicalize the people who, see you as the enemy and, to a certain extent, you identify as the enemy.
So I guess really the question is, what expectation should we put on ourselves and those around us on building those bridges? I very much understand and am empathetic to the fact that even mention of the name Louis Farrakhan is very triggering for many people, especially those of Jewish communities. As a queer person, there are areas in which I can identify harmful language that applies directly to me. At the same time, I also, as I mentioned, challenge myself to do what I can to create this environment where we're not getting rid of people, but we're getting rid of the hate. We're getting rid of the misinformation from which that hate is bred. I wonder what your ideas are on the opportunity and responsibility that we all have to create this renewed world, this promised land, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I don't want to deliver like edicts to people over what they should or shouldn't do, like because, like I said, like everyone like isn't or shouldn't, feel obligated to like put themselves in some sort of situation where they don't feel safe. But, if you feel like there's a bridge to be built, then try and build it. If you think it's worth your time and you think that something good can come out of it. But yeah, it's for every individual to decide. And, when it comes to people like Farrakhan, like he's a religious leader, but there are also people in, pop music too, or like, celebrities who often spread misinformation or, ignorant beliefs sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're just about to the end of our hour, and where I wanted to close, Michael, is just
Yeah.
talking about how this work has impacted you personally. We met through a mutual colleague in the music industry some months ago, and I do have to say I was quite nervous to engage certain dialogues with you because I didn't want to be written off or misunderstood. So I think that there was a level of filling each other out that was also there, in addition to just courage to say what we felt, not toward creating shock value or building walls, but really gaining understanding. So I'll say, in addition to preparing this presentation with you, I've very much enjoyed just engaging the person to person dialogue outside of the context of the preparation of this presentation. I think it has shown me exactly the point that we're trying to make, the power of dialogue to bridge communities and to spread understanding.
Yeah, likewise. I feel like this goes to show like the importance of friendship, because like allyship or like accomplice is another word people are now using sometimes. But I think, sometimes it can be a bit dry and performative to just be like, okay, I'll show up at, the march, I'll use your hashtags, I'll, read the books, I'll yell at whoever the bad guy is. It's just like, no, there's like you have to humanize each other. This isn't just about, you know, trauma bonding or anger bonding or outrage bonding, you know, even though that's what social media is, you know, powered by, unfortunately. But, you know, friendship is really where you see, you know, a type of flourishing of, you know, understanding and, you know, thriving of these connections, right? These connections aren't really thriving if it's just, you know, pure solidarity. Like there's a place for that, but like to allow these bridge points, these intersections of these communities to thrive means to, you know, invite people who are different than you over for dinner, like go see movies with them, go share funny memes with them. Like not everything has to be political. So yeah, that would be, you know, my so-called words of wisdom of the day.
And thank you very much for them. So just as was the case for the two of us, music really can be that jumping off point for dialogue and for conversation. So next week, Michael and I will return to cover a few of the topics that we discussed today, but to really point them to the upcoming program, sort of as a debrief of how specific pieces of music and intentional programming can offer broader dialogue, and how we can utilize music as musical professionals, not only to create those dialogues and bridge those gaps within the field of music, but to inspire that for the broader community. I believe that music can be the example for the entire world of how we can create peace, and it's up to each and every one of us to do everything that we can to facilitate that. So thank you all very much. With that, I'll pass it back to Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Just needed to add add myself in, and a big thanks to Garrett and to Michael for a wonderful, very thoughtful conversation. This is really just getting us to be just to percolate wonderful ideas, and thank you for all the examples, all the wonderful discussion, and invite everyone to attend either in person or you can attend online through catching the stream of our concert this Sunday of a wonderful program called Music and Justice, a program of living composers working on musical expressions to seek justice, as well as a performance of Dave Brubeck's landmark work, The Gates of Justice. We also invite you all to come again same time next week as we continue the conversation. Thank you very much.